Welcome to the Sober Podcast. I'm your host, Jamie Brickhouse, and our sober celebrity guest today is Maia Szalavitz. She is a neuroscience journalist and has authored several books, including the New York Times bestseller Unbroken Brain, a revolutionary new way of understanding addiction, help at any cost, how the troubled teen industry cons parents and hurts kids, and her most recent book, which I have been reading on the beach, and it is some serious juicy, but it's a fun beach read, Undoing Drugs, How Harm Reduction is Changing the Future of Drugs and Addiction. And I came to know Maia's work before her books through her provocative, trenchant essays in the New York Times, for whom she is a contributing opinion writer about addiction treatment. Thank you for joining us, Maia. It's great to have you on the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I wish I was out there in Fire Island.
Oh, I wish you were too. Well, when you're out here next, let me know, and we'll meet up. But we try to be topic focused for these interviews, and there's so many different ways we could go with all of the books and pieces you've written. So I wanted to focus on how does viewing addiction as a learning disorder support the harm reduction movement. And in your book, the current book that I'm reading, in Undoing Drugs, you write that the wisdom of the Talmud says that the saving one life is equivalent to saving the entire world. And these ideas are at the very heart of harm reduction, which takes the perspective that every life is worth saving. And there's a lot of misconceptions, now this is me speaking, about the harm reduction, both within the recovery community and outside of it. So tell us what harm reduction is and what it is not.
Sure. So basically, harm reduction is the idea in drug policy and in treatment that what should matter most is stopping people from getting hurt rather than stopping them from getting high. And everything else kind of flows from that. I generally think, and I think a lot of people agree, that, if somebody else is euphoric on a chemical, as long as they're not hurting themselves or others, I really don't care. I don't think the government go for it, whatever that, if you're getting unearned pleasure, that's not my problem. But if you're going to hurt yourself or others, then it is, society's problem, and the government and other people might feel the need to do something about it. And I think, we should be protecting people's lives. And if we are using policy that hurts people to try to help them, that is not really very effective. And that's a lot of what the drug war has basically done. Mm-hmm. And so harm reduction just says, no, we are going to look at harm. We are going to focus on keeping people alive, on keeping them healthy, not on some ridiculous quest to stop people from getting unearned euphoria because Puritanism.
Right. And it's, I'm sober 14 and a half years in a 12-step program. And, my knee-jerk reaction when I started hearing about harm reduction or becoming aware of it was I thought, oh, it's a cop-out so that you don't have to be abstinent. And I know that is not the case anymore. And I've also, as the more years I have sober, used to be there'd be, oh, so-and-so, that one, he still smokes pot, or, that one still, uses poppers or whatever. But now I'm to the point, I don't care. I don't care what they do, as long as it's not harming me. And if this program is working for them, what does it matter?
Yeah.
And so,
no, and I mean,
go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, when I was in early recovery, I was also very active in 12-step groups. And this was at the time when AIDS was very deadly, and there were no real effective treatments for it. And I was just kind of horrified that people were like, well, we can't give them clean needles because that's enabling them. So, by the time they get in recovery, they'll be HIV positive, which at that point was pretty much a death sentence. And I was just like, what? Really? How many people relapse? How can you think that? I get that people are concerned about abstinence versus non-abstinence, but at the very basic minimum, we need to keep people alive because dead people don't recover. And so
exactly,
that is where I came from. And I was like, I was getting really annoyed because I would see like act up doing all this cool stuff, focused on gay men. And I was like, where's the act up for people in recovery? Like, why are we just like letting each other die? And in fact, some of us saying, well, some have to die, so some will live. No, this is a disease. We need to stop it. Like, so that's really how I came to the harm reduction discussion.
And was it also, did it help you to get sober or stay clean? You said you were in a 12-step, but did harm reduction also work for your recovery?
Yes. I mean, basically what happened is that before I got into recovery, somebody taught me to use bleach to clean my needles. Mm-hmm. And that's so then right. I was not infected when I got into recovery. And so, I felt really guilty. I saw like, so many other people like, getting sick, and I just didn't think it was right. And so if that person who taught me to use bleach had just said, oh, you just got to stop, I wouldn't have stopped at that particular moment. I was like, I was deeply addicted, and like, I didn't know how to stop at that particular moment. I certainly knew how to use a clean needle, because clean needles are better. They work better. And so I was always like, okay, this is like, I have no, there was a stupid myth that was going around that like, oh, people like to share needles. We don't like to share drugs, but we just like to share needles. It's all peace and love when it comes to, or like, no. Yeah, no. I mean, like, I know there's some kinky people, and that's totally fine as long as you make sure you're both not sharing dirty needles. But the thing is, at that time, it was killing lots of people. Half of the people who were injecting drugs were already HIV positive by the time the virus was even discovered in New York. And so that's like, it was, that's where I came into it. And then, at that time, like a lot of the early people in the harm reduction movement in the United States were also 12-steppers themselves. And they had this whole like, oh, what do we think about this? How do we deal with this? And, so for a long time, there was this idea of, oh, well, harm reduction is like recovery readiness. And so we will, keep people alive, but we're going to move them into abstinence eventually. Right. And that still happened, and that there's nothing wrong with that. And that's not, it's just that, as you start to understand harm reduction more, you start to realize that abstinence isn't the only way. A lot of people do get better by different pathways. Yeah. And that, sort of demanding perfection in abstinence often causes harm. Like, for many years, people would get thrown off of like methadone for using marijuana. And, methadone and buprenorphine are the only two treatments we have that cut the death rate from opioid use disorder by 50% or more. No abstinence treatment does that. And this is as long as you stay on the meds, you have a 50% reduction in your risk of dying. That's like, if we had that for cancer, we'd be dancing in the streets. But
exactly, right.
But here we're like, no, you're not really clean. And we will take this medication away from you if you smoke marijuana, which is ridiculous. We're going to kill you for smoking pot. Like, really? Not
only punitive, it's deathly. It's
yeah. I mean, yeah. We don't throw people off of insulin for like, saying F you to the doctor, or like, eating a donut. So it is, so anyway, so I, over time, basically by like learning about the research, became aware that what I had been taught in rehab and some of the things that I was being told in the program were not accurate for everyone. Certainly there are many people who cannot control their use of their drug of choice. And I am one of them. I do not use cocaine or heroin or opioids or anything, that I was really addicted to. Yeah. But the idea that everyone must use this one path, it's just not true.
Yeah. And as I was saying, it's taken me a few years in recovery to come to that realization as well through, through seeing the experience of others and direct observation. Your books and articles challenge the way we think about addiction and recovery. You assert that addiction is a learning disorder. What do you mean by that?
So basically what I mean is a couple of things. The first thing is that you cannot get addicted without learning. You have to learn that the drug does something for you and that this thing is a thing that you want. If I were
and are we talking drugs, and are we talking all substances, alcohol and drugs?
Gambling, anything. Like, you have to learn that this thing gives you this other thing. So that, like, when I take this drug, I feel X, or when I gamble, I feel X. And you start to feel that, like, that is essential to your ability to function emotionally. But for example, if I were to, like, take someone hostage and shoot them up with a drug, they might become physically dependent to the point where they would be sick if they don't have it. But if they don't know what the drug is and they don't know what the symptoms of withdrawal are, they're going to think they have the flu. They're going to be pissed at me because I was doing something evil. But I cannot turn someone else into a person with addiction. And the person has to like the experience, or at least find it gives them something, to fall in love with it and basically develop compulsive behavior despite negative consequences. So that's one aspect. The other aspect of seeing addiction as learning disorder is that what it seems to do in the brain is work on the area where we fall in love, or we are drawn to taking care of our children, or we are doing other survival-based things. But it's fundamentally a motivational system in the brain that's there to get you to survive and reproduce. And so what it does is it sets your priorities. So if you fall in love, you will put that other person first. You might do some really crazy things that you normally wouldn't do. Like, maybe you're going to, like, move across the country. Maybe you're going to reject
quit your job.
Quit your job. You might start listening to music that you otherwise hate. Like, I mean, there's, like, all kinds of things people do.
It's a good analogy. I like this.
And so, but that is a deep form of emotional learning. And it resets your priorities in ways that are helpful if the relationship is healthy, or if you're trying to, take care of a kid, but that are deeply unhelpful if it's a relationship that's unhealthy, or a relationship with a substance or an activity that's harming you or someone else. So the other aspect of seeing addiction as a developmental disorder, which is often used interchangeably with learning disorders, is that 90% of all addictions start between the teenage years and early adulthood. And that is a sensitive period of brain development. 75% of all psychiatric disorders also begin to appear at this time. And so something is going on in the brain when you're a teenager that makes you especially vulnerable. And so that is a key sign that this is a disorder of development. There is that 10% that don't, but 90% is a pretty huge percent. And so when you look at things like a classic developmental disorder like autism, you can see this in, like, 2 or 3 year olds. You can see the beginning signs. Like something like schizophrenia, you probably won't see until the teens or early adulthood. But these things tend to happen when the brain is going through a particular shift. And so addiction classically fits that model. And so those are the main reasons that I see it as a learning disorder. And frankly, like, there's nobody argues that learning isn't involved in addiction, because you can't, because you'd just be wrong. Like, there's too much data otherwise.
And then once you start doing it, and once you fall in love with it, you learn how to get it, how to use it, how to manage it, or how to, try to manage it. When looking at addiction as a learning disorder, what in your opinion is the best method or methods for treatment, and how does that bolster harm reduction?
So if we understand that this is a problem of learning, then we understand that people are not going to change overnight typically. People, if I want to learn to like play the piano, I'm going to need some technique. If you just hit me for playing a wrong note, maybe eventually I'll figure out some crappy technique. But but
You're never going to play well.
No, and I'm really going to hate it, and I'm probably not going to like music all that much, right? But so on the other hand, like I'm going to make mistakes when I'm playing. Like that's just the way it is when you're learning something. But over time with practice, I get better. So similarly with recovery, and this is where harm reduction comes in, because you've got to keep people alive through that learning period. Mm-hmm. You've got to keep people protected when they are going to have some slips because they don't yet have the skills to maintain their recovery. And also harm reduction obviously applies even for people who are like not aiming to achieve abstinence or any sort of recovery, because the idea is we care about people whether they are doing what we want them to do or not. But the learning part is important in harm reduction because it works with how harm reduction works. And so this doesn't mean that 12-step can't work for some people, or right. that harm reduction, like non-abstinence recovery, is the one true way or anything like that. It's just like, people in 12-step acknowledge the learning aspect of it all the time. Like, there's beginners, you have people, sponsors,
and there are people who relapse and people who come back, and they're usually always welcome back into that.
Yeah. And the thing is, like, I have like my only thing that I would change, well, maybe there would be some other things, but a key thing I would change if I were in charge would be, in terms of 12-step programs, would just be that, like, I think if you have 13 years and you slip for a day, those 13 years don't go away, and you're not just as much of a beginner, and so what I would do, and
I've always said that too, and I
would like be like, people, you right. get 90 days, you get your 13 years back. And so that way it still honors like consistency and length of time in recovery as an achievement, but it does not punish people over and over and over again when they have a slip. And so
that's fine. In the big book of that 12-step program, and there's one line that I quibble with, which says half measures availed us of nothing. And I was like, that's not true, because right. All those measures led to something, and even if you didn't have complete success, you learned something along the way and you advanced a bit. And if that meant that you weren't drinking or using for 2 weeks, that was 2 weeks you weren't drinking or using. So that was 2 weeks where your life was probably better. So half measures.
Right. And you're improving, like, yeah, like, if you get somebody who is drinking, 10 drinks a day down to 5, they're not sober, but they're a heck of a lot healthier. Their liver is healthier than if they're continuing with the 10. So
hold on just a second, because we've got to take a quick commercial break, but we will be back in a few seconds. So everybody stick with us.
Hi, I'm Sonia, the founder of Everbloom. We help you change your relationship with alcohol through connection and conversation. We provide small group meetings where you can share your story and get the encouragement and support you need to achieve your goals. Whatever your goals are, we're a judgment-free space. You can find us at joineverbloom.com, BLUME, and try us out with a free meeting.
And we are back talking to Maia Szalavitz, and we're talking about harm reduction and looking at addiction as a learning disorder. In your current book, Undoing Drugs, you write the overdose crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic changed the harm reduction movement. How? Or for the better, I think.
Yes. What basically happened was COVID brought the term harm reduction and the idea of harm reduction into the mainstream in a way that it had never been before, because suddenly we were all faced with the fact that a crucial part of our emotional life, i.e. socializing, was now risky. And the fact is that you're never going to get people to completely eliminate any form of risky behavior. People are going to socialize because it's essential for mental health. And so what we had to do was reduce the harm, minimize the harm associated with doing that. And so people were looking to the previous pandemic we had, which was AIDS, and harm reduction, by then had sort of become a known thing in public health and certainly in the drug use world. And so the term began to be very much more widespread. The other thing that happened, of course, was the overdose crisis. People had seen that criminalization does not work, and that, we continued cracking down on drugs and having long sentences and all this kind of stuff. And we were still nonetheless in the world's worst and the country's worst overdose crisis in history. And so people started looking for other things, and they started to see, well, wait a minute, these harm reduction people are maybe onto something, and it, especially naloxone, which is the overdose antidote.
Yeah.
Before the harm reduction movement existed, it was only available to doctors by prescription in the hospital or in ambulances, if you were lucky. And then a guy named Dan Bigg said, wait a minute, like, this drug is harmless if you use it erroneously. Like, if you give it to somebody who's having a heart attack, you're not going to solve their heart attack, but you're not going to make it worse. But if they happen to be having an overdose, you're going to save their life.
Yeah.
So, you could give people a massive dose of naloxone and you cannot kill them with it. So it, if you are a person who is physically dependent and or addicted to opioids, you will get mighty sick, but you will not die.
Yeah. And again, you're saving lives here is what we're talking about. Right?
Yeah. And so he was just like, everybody should have this. It should be in every first aid kit. And as soon as I had been thinking, wow, this drug naloxone exists. Like, why isn't it available? And I sort of started doing research, and I was like, oh, this guy's giving it out. This is cool. Like, so I wrote it. I think I wrote the first national piece on it for the Village Voice, like in the 90s at some point. So it was great to see that, someone was out there doing it. And, without Dan Bigg and without the work that he did, like spreading naloxone around the country and like carrying a duffel bag full of it and like convincing people to like give it out at syringe exchanges and other places, we wouldn't have this incredibly life-saving drug that has literally at this point saved tens of thousands of lives. And most of those saves are not by police or people, who are professionals. They're by other people with addiction, who see that their friend has gone out and they help them.
And have access to it. Yeah.
Exactly. That part of the overdose crisis was obviously harm reduction was a thing that you could reach for that already existed that would help with that. Also, the fact that the overdose crisis was perceived as white meant that people wanted to be gentler, and meant that, in our racist society, all of a sudden, these are people we care about. So we want to be nice to them. And so, so that, that also helped harm reduction get out of being like this fringy thing, to being a mainstream approach, and in fact being officially part of Joe Biden's policy, when for many years the government suppressed it. In fact, you could not use the term harm reduction if you wanted to get a grant from the government to study needle exchange, which is obviously harm reduction, for many, many years. Like, and we had people representing the United States going around the world trying to get the phrase taken out of UN documents because they recognized it as a threat to prohibition.
I wanted to talk a little bit about tough love, and you've written quite a bit about that, and I remember your piece last year in the Times about it, that it does more harm than good. And what do you mean? And do you think it's changing?
I mean, so basically, if we actually believe addiction is a disease, the idea that punishment is going to fix it, or being harsh and tough on people is going to fix it, is pretty ridiculous, especially since the official definition of addiction by the major organizations that define these things is compulsive use despite negative consequences. In other words, punishment is the one thing we know won't work. So,
and you tell a story in this book about the I forget the woman's name, but where her son ends up going to jail, and then that's when he first uses heroin. So the punishment actually made him a worse drug addict.
Yeah, and I mean, there's unfortunately, there's unfortunately a lot of stories like that, and you know, I mean, when somebody is exhibiting symptoms of a psychiatric disorder, throwing them out of the house does not help. You know, there may be times when if you have somebody that's like stealing from you, or like you have younger kids that you need to protect, then you might have to do that to protect your family. And
or they're physically abusive, or
right. There's many reasons you may have to throw someone out, but
verbally abusive. To where
it's not to help that person. It is to protect yourself.
Yeah.
It may get that person to see things differently. It may make them worse. But what we know is that like this whole idea of hitting bottom is a narrative device. It's not a scientific fact. So what I mean is that like, if you think about it, who's more likely to recover? The homeless guy who has no family, no support, no job, no education, or the doctor who's got a wife and kids and a cat and a dog and many years of education and a very prestigious job? I'm going to bet on the doctor. And if you look at the research, I am correct. It is much more likely for people to recover if they have support rather than if they don't have support. Now, this doesn't mean everybody should be going out and like buying drugs for their kids. But
that's not what you're advocating. Okay.
No, you know, I mean, where if you had access to a prescription opioid and your kid was using fentanyl, would I recommend giving your kid the cleaner prescription opioid? Yes, I would. But you know, that's harm reduction, right? But just the idea that making things worse for people will make it better is just backwards. Like if you think about why people tend to use drugs, you know, certainly plenty of people are using them to celebrate. But when you are addicted, you are generally using them to feel okay, to assuage your pain, to comfort yourself, to calm yourself down, to make yourself feel better. So making you feel worse is going to make you want to make yourself feel better. And if you are addicted to drugs, what are you going to do? More drugs. So, you know,
it seems perfectly logical.
Yeah. And so, you know, I think that it's certainly the case that some people have a certain amount of consequences and they change their behavior. But we don't know what it is that makes some people change and some people just get worse and worse and worse and worse. And so just adding consequences is just not helpful. I see that I have lines on my face because of my shades. Do you want me to?
Oh, no, you're fine. You're fine. And where do you think, you know, and you've been, you know, a huge proponent in changing the way that we think about addiction and recovery and harm reduction. And where do you think the world is headed on how we view and treat addiction?
Well, I hope we're getting better. I know that people are trying to like stir up a backlash against harm reduction and claim ridiculous things like, oh, San Francisco has homeless people because harm reduction. And, you know, well, who has the highest overdose rate in the country? West Virginia. How much homelessness do they have? Very little. Like how much harm reduction do they have? Very little,
I would suppose.
You know, this is, you know, this is ridiculous. You know, is giving someone a clean needle going to make them not be homeless? No, it is not. You need housing for that. But you know, so there's political attempts to stir up a backlash. But I think more and more people are coming to realize that harm reduction is sensible and humane and not incompatible with 12-step, not incompatible with people whose way of recovery is abstinence. It's not incompatible with anything that works. And so I think,
which I think is a very important part to make, to point to make, is because that harm reduction can work in side by side by 12-step programs or other programs, which I think a lot of people miss that point when they hear harm.
No, and it's really it's really a shame, because a lot of people, and I certainly get this. Like, if you're very newly in recovery, you want to cling to what's working for you, and you're going to be quite rigid about that. And the idea that somebody else might be able to not be totally abstinent is going to be threatening to you. Right. I get it.
And you might be jealous. Why can they use that?
All of these things. Right. So I think you should go to your meeting and talk about this, and you should be open about this. And you should know that, okay, what works for me is this. What works for someone else might be something else. I don't want to hang out with those people right now because that's not safe for me. But the bottom line is that just because something works for me, it doesn't mean it will work for everybody. And that, live and let live, right? Yeah. We need to just really, take care of ourselves. And what I'm really excited about, actually, I'm going to write about this for the Times at some point. There are new recovery community organizations that embrace multiple pathways, and that, they have like a compound in a sense. And, over here on one corner, they have like meetings and abstinence and abstinence-based housing. And over here on this other corner, they have like needle exchange. And the idea is to make it seamless so that people can be where they are in recovery and not be threatened or triggered by anybody else, but also be able to, if they are slipping, do so with a clean needle as opposed to, with a dirty one.
Right, in a safe environment. Yeah.
Yeah. And so, right. And similarly, if someone is at the needle exchange and they're like, you know what, this is not working. I am not controlling this. This is getting the best of me. I really do need to do something different. Okay, the meeting's over there. Okay, the detox is over there, okay, we can give you a buprenorphine script right over here. And so organizations, like there's been organizations that integrate multiple pathways, since the earliest days of harm reduction, but they're only now really beginning to take off. And I think this is the way forward in the treatment system. I mean, if you think about like cancer treatment, people don't go around saying chemo is the one way, those radiation people are wrong.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Right. And if you have cancer, you want to try everything possible.
Well, exactly. And also, like, if you have cancer, you're not automatically a doctor. If you got 90 days cancer free, you can't go and treat somebody else. We have to separate the support groups from the professionals. And like that, I think if one of the best things we could do for treatment and for 12-step programs is keep them separate. You can refer to each other, but don't make teaching people 12-step the center of treatment, because otherwise that's the only path you're going to be able to offer. If you can, and so I think, people are developing these models where you don't have to have that conversion thing going on, and where, people can just find the thing that suits them the best. And I feel like some people in 12-step programs fear that, well, if we did that, 12-step seems kind of corny and old-fashioned and uncool and like nobody would come. I don't think that's true, actually. Like, I think that it works a lot better when it's kind of underground and kind of like, not like you're mandated to do this, but more like, hey, this guy seems really cool. That's how he did it.
It feels cool and special.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think like divorcing 12-step from treatment would be really good for both groups and would not end up with fewer people finding their way to 12-step, because frankly, I have never met a single person with addiction who has not heard that 12-step exists.
Yep, you're right. And one last question, which we ask almost all of our guests, which is, what is the best lesson you've learned in recovery, and how did it help you?
I mean, this is corny, but gratitude. Like,
No, it's an evergreen.
Yeah, I mean, because it's just like, when you realize just how lucky you are and just how amazing it is to like be able to like live this life on this planet at this time, everything else can really flow from that. And when you're grateful, you are more connective to other people, and you're less of a jerk. And it's like all good stuff. I think, again, all of the other thing is that like there's an enormous difference between doing something voluntarily and being forced to do something. If like you force me to be grateful, I'm going to be resentful.
Right.
If I choose to be grateful, I'm going to be grateful. If you force me to feel powerless, again, I'm going to be resentful. And especially if I have a trauma history or something like that, it's not going to be good for me. But if I recognize, oh, wow, like I really, I tried controlling this up a million different ways on my own and that did not work. Okay. And I think, because like so much of the problem with addiction treatment that we have is like imposing things on people instead of like doing attraction, not promotion.
Yeah.
And so those are, I think, some of the key things.
Well, that's a great way to end it. And I'm grateful that you came on the show with us today. And we definitely want to have you back when you do that piece for the Times about the new wave of recovery places. And to all our listeners, thank you for your continued support. Visit us on soberpodcast.com and all places where you find major podcasts to leave us a review, sign up for our mailing list. You will also find the contact information and all the information in our show notes for Maia Szalavitz and her books. I am your host, Jamie Brickhouse. You can find me on TikTok, where I tell a true story in high heels every day. And I'm the author of Dangerous When Wet, a memoir of booze, sex, and my mother. Signing out from the Sober Podcast. Tune in for another show next week.